Good evening, and welcome to Truth Report. I'm Alex Truth, and tonight we are pulling back the curtain on a global pattern that should make every citizen pay attention. From Manila to Tirana, from Brussels to Detroit, the same story keeps repeating, public money flowing into private hands while ordinary people foot the bill.
I'm Maya Clarity, and what we've uncovered tonight is striking. Four stories, for different continents, but one common thread: accountability is crumbling. Corruption rankings are sliding, protesters are clashing with police, fossil fuel giants are hoarding profits while the planet burns, and an EV company backed by Saudi sovereign wealth is slashing American jobs right before launching a new vehicle. Let's get into it.
We're starting tonight in the Philippines, where a damning new report from Transparency International shows the country is heading in the wrong direction on corruption. Then we'll take you to the streets of Tirana, Albania, where tens of thousands of people are risking tear gas and water cannons to demand their prime minister resign. After that, we're looking at a proposal that could reshape Europe's energy economy by taxing fossil fuel windfall profits. And we'll close with Lucid Motors cutting 12% of its American workforce even as it prepares to launch a $50,000 midsize SUV.
Every one of these stories connects to the same fundamental question: who is really in charge? Is it the people, or is it the money? Let's find out. Alex, take us to Manila.
According to the South China Morning Post, the Philippines has dropped 6 places in Transparency International's 2025 Corruption Perceptions Index, falling to 120th out of 182 countries and territories. The country scored just 32 out of a possible 100, where 100 represents a clean government. To put that in perspective, that score puts the Philippines in the bottom third of every nation on Earth.
And this isn't some abstract number, Alex. This drop is directly tied to real scandals with real consequences. The biggest one dominating headlines is a multi-billion peso flood control program that has become a symbol of everything wrong with governance in the Philippines. We're talking about money that was supposed to protect Filipino communities from devastating floods, a life-or-death infrastructure issue in a country battered by typhoons every single year.
That's exactly right. The allegations surrounding this flood control program involve what critics call systemic financial wrongdoing. Court cases are now underway, and the details emerging paint a picture of funds being siphoned, contracts being awarded under questionable circumstances, and communities left vulnerable because the infrastructure they were promised either wasn't built or wasn't built properly. People die in floods, Maya. This isn't white-collar crime in the abstract. This is corruption that kills.
And the term that keeps coming up in reporting on the Philippines is grease money, the informal payments, the bribes, the under-the-table dealings that have become so normalized they have their own vocabulary. When corruption has its own casual slang, that tells you how deeply embedded it is in the system. Transparency International's findings confirm what many Filipinos already know from lived experience, that doing business, getting permits, navigating government services often requires greasing palms.
The economic consequences are measurable and severe. Investor confidence is taking a direct hit. When your country drops 6 places on a global corruption index, international investors notice. Foreign direct investment decisions are influenced by these rankings. Companies looking at Southeast Asia for manufacturing, for tech development, for regional headquarters, they look at these numbers. And when they see the Philippines sliding while neighbors like Vietnam and Indonesia are making governance reforms, capital flows elsewhere.
And let's talk about who suffers most. It's not the politicians skimming from flood control budgets. It's not the business elites who can afford to pay the grease money. It's ordinary Filipinos, the street vendor who can't get a permit without a bribe, the family whose home floods because the drainage project was never completed, the young professional who sees no path to advancement without connections. Corruption is a tax on the poor, and in the Philippines, that tax just got heavier.
What's particularly frustrating is that the Philippines has all the institutional frameworks you'd expect: anti-corruption agencies, oversight bodies, a free press that reports aggressively on these issues. The problem isn't a lack of laws or institutions. It's a lack of political will to enforce them. When a multi-billion peso scandal unfolds and the court proceedings drag on for years, the message sent to every government official is clear: the risks of corruption are low and the rewards are high.
And this connects to a broader pattern across Southeast Asia and developing economies worldwide. Transparency International's index shows that globally, progress on corruption has stagnated. The Philippines isn't an outlier, it's a symptom. But here's what makes it especially concerning: President Marcos ran on promises of economic modernization and good governance. This ranking is a direct repudiation of those promises. The international community is watching, investors are recalculating, and Filipino citizens are the ones paying the price.
The question now is whether this serves as a wake-up call or just another data point that gets buried under the next news cycle. History suggests the latter, but the Filipino people deserve better. Let's move now from Manila to Tirana, because what's happening in Albania right now is extraordinary.
Alex, the scenes coming out of Albania are dramatic and deeply significant. According to Al Jazeera's reporting, violent clashes have erupted near the Albanian parliament as protesters are demanding the resignation of Prime Minister Rama. This isn't a small demonstration, we're talking about massive crowds flooding the streets of Tirana, and the police response has been aggressive. Tear gas, water cannons, physical confrontations between demonstrators and security forces.
Let's set the context here, because this didn't come out of nowhere. These protests are rooted in a corruption investigation that has shaken Albanian politics. Demonstrators are demanding accountability, they want answers about allegations of government corruption, and they want Rama to step down. The opposition has been galvanized, and what started as political pressure has become a genuine popular uprising with people from across Albanian society joining in.
Prime Minister Rama has been in power since 2013, that's 13 years. And over that period, critics say his government has systematically concentrated power, weakened independent institutions, and created an environment where corruption can flourish with impunity. Albania is a candidate for European Union membership, and that process is supposed to come with reforms on rule of law and anti-corruption measures. But what we're seeing in the streets suggests that many Albanians feel those reforms have been superficial at best.
The violence near parliament is particularly alarming. When citizens feel they have no institutional path to accountability, when the courts are perceived as compromised, when the media is under pressure, when the parliament itself is seen as a rubber stamp, they take to the streets. That's what's happening in Tirana. These aren't radicals or extremists. These are people who feel that the democratic process has failed them, and direct action is their only remaining option.
And the international response matters here. Albania's EU accession process gives Brussels enormous leverage. The European Union has consistently stated that rule of law and anti-corruption reforms are prerequisites for membership. If the EU stays silent while protesters are hit with tear gas for demanding accountability, it sends a message not just to Albania but to every aspiring member state, that the EU's stated values are negotiable when geopolitics are at stake.
There's a deeper structural issue here that connects directly to our Philippine story. In both cases, you have governments that have the formal architecture of democracy, elections, parliaments, courts, but where the substance of democratic governance has been hollowed out. The institutions exist, but they serve the interests of those in power rather than the public. It's what political scientists call competitive authoritarianism, and it's spreading.
What's powerful about the Albanian protests is the clarity of the demand. This isn't about ideology or left versus right. It's about a fundamental principle, that leaders must be accountable to the people they govern. When tens of thousands of citizens risk physical harm to make that point, it deserves global attention. The courage of those protesters standing their ground against water cannons should not be overlooked.
And let's be clear about the stakes. Albania sits at a strategic crossroads in southeastern Europe. Its trajectory matters for regional stability, for NATO, for the EU's credibility as an institution that promotes democratic values. If Rama can weather these protests without meaningful reforms, it emboldens autocratic-leaning leaders across the Western Balkans and beyond. The outcome in Tirana will ripple far beyond Albania's borders.
We'll be watching this closely. Now, Alex, let's shift to a different kind of power structure, the fossil fuel industry in Europe, and a bold proposal that could fundamentally change the equation on who pays for the energy transition.
Maya, this next story gets to the heart of one of the most important economic debates of our time. According to reporting from CleanTechnica, there's a growing push in Europe to tax fossil fuel windfall profits as a tool to fund the continent's energy transition. And the numbers here are staggering. Fossil fuels still account for roughly 70% of the European Union's energy consumption. In 2024 alone, the EU spent more than €375 billion on fossil fuel imports. Let that sink in. €375 billion leaving the European economy and flowing to oil and gas-producing nations.
And here's the number that should make every European citizen furious. While the EU was hemorrhaging hundreds of billions on fuel imports, fossil fuel companies operating in and around Europe made approximately €180 billion in profits. These aren't normal profits from efficient business operations. These are windfall gains driven by energy price volatility, geopolitical crises, and market structures that allow fossil fuel companies to profit from the very instability that harms consumers.
The proposal being discussed is straightforward in concept, even if the politics are complicated. Tax a portion of those extraordinary profits and redirect the revenue toward renewable energy infrastructure, energy efficiency programs, and support for communities transitioning away from fossil fuel dependence. It's not a radical idea, it's been done before. The EU implemented a temporary windfall profit levy after energy prices spiked following Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The question now is whether to make it permanent and structural.
And the arguments in favor are compelling. Europe has committed to ambitious climate targets, but the funding gap for the energy transition is enormous. Somebody has to pay for the wind farms, the solar installations, the grid upgrades, the building retrofits, the electric vehicle charging networks. Right now, much of that cost is being borne by taxpayers and consumers through higher energy bills and government subsidies. Meanwhile, the companies that profit most from the current fossil fuel system are sitting on mountains of cash.
The fossil fuel industry's response is predictable. They argue that taxing their profits will discourage investment, harm energy security, and ultimately raise prices for consumers. But let's interrogate that claim. These companies have been making record profits for years, and where has that money gone? Largely into share buybacks and dividends, returning cash to shareholders rather than investing in the energy transition. BP, Shell, Total Energies, all of them have scaled back their renewable energy commitments while boosting shareholder returns. They're not investing in the future. They're cashing out.
And this is where the connection to corruption becomes relevant, even if it's a different kind of corruption. When fossil fuel companies spend millions on lobbying to block climate legislation, when they fund think tanks that spread doubt about clean energy, when they use their political influence to maintain subsidies and tax breaks worth billions, that's a form of systemic corruption. It may be legal, but it operates on the same principle as the grease money in the Philippines, using wealth to bend the rules in your favor at the public's expense.
The scale of fossil fuel subsidies globally is obscene. The International Monetary Fund has estimated that fossil fuels receive roughly $7 trillion a year in subsidies when you include the costs of air pollution, climate damage, and other externalities that companies don't pay for. $7 trillion. That's not a market functioning efficiently. That's a market rigged to protect incumbent industries at the expense of human health and planetary stability.
So when we talk about taxing fossil fuel profits, we're really talking about a modest correction to a system that has been tilted in favor of oil and gas companies for decades. Europe has the opportunity to lead on this. The temporary windfall levy proved it can be done. The question is whether European leaders have the political courage to make it permanent, or whether the fossil fuel lobby will once again succeed in protecting its interests over the public good.
And let's connect this to energy security, because that's the argument the industry hides behind. Europe's dependence on fossil fuel imports, 70% of its energy consumption, is itself a massive security vulnerability. Every euro spent on building domestic renewable energy capacity is an euro that doesn't flow to petrostates. Taxing windfall profits to fund the transition isn't anti-business. It's pro-security, pro-independence, and pro-citizen.
The math is clear. The political will is the variable. And right now, fossil fuel companies are betting that their lobbying power is stronger than the public's demand for a fair energy transition. History will judge whether they were right. Now, Alex, let's bring it closer to home with our final story, Lucid Motors and what's happening to American EV workers.
According to reporting from Electrek, Lucid Motors, trading under the ticker LCID, announced on Friday that it's cutting 12% of its U.S. workforce. This is a significant reduction for a company that's been positioning itself as a premium competitor in the electric vehicle market. And the timing is telling. These cuts come as Lucid prepares to launch its next vehicle, a midsize SUV expected to start around $50,000, which would be its most affordable and potentially highest volume product yet.
Let's unpack who Lucid is, because this company's ownership structure tells you a lot about the forces shaping the American EV industry. Lucid Motors is majority owned by the Public Investment Fund of Saudi Arabia, that's the Saudi Sovereign Wealth Fund. We're talking about one of the world's largest oil-producing nations funding an electric vehicle company. There's a strategic logic there. Saudi Arabia is trying to diversify its economy beyond oil, but the irony should not be lost on anyone, especially in the context of our fossil fuel profits story.
The 12% workforce reduction is being framed as a move to improve profitability ahead of the company's next growth stage. That's corporate speak for, we're burning through cash and need to show investors we can get closer to break-even before we launch a mass-market vehicle. Lucid has been producing its luxury Air sedan, which starts above $70,000, in relatively small volumes. The upcoming midsize SUV at $50,000 is supposed to be the vehicle that brings Lucid to scale.
But here's the human cost that gets buried in earnings reports and press releases. 12% of the U.S. workforce means real people, engineers, factory workers, administrative staff, losing their jobs. These are workers who chose to join a startup EV company, often taking a risk on a less established employer because they believed in the mission of electrifying transportation. And now they're being cut so the company's financial metrics look better for Wall Street.
This pattern is endemic in the EV industry right now. Companies are caught between enormous upfront capital requirements, building factories, developing battery technology, establishing supply chains, and investor demands for profitability. Tesla went through similar growing pains, and now nearly every EV startup is facing the same squeeze. Rivian has cut costs. Fisker went bankrupt. Lordstown Motors collapsed. The road from promising EV startup to profitable automaker is littered with casualties, and those casualties are disproportionately workers.
And the broader context matters enormously here. The EV transition is one of the most important industrial transformations of our time. It's essential for addressing climate change, reducing air pollution, and building energy independence. But the way it's being executed, driven primarily by private capital seeking returns rather than by public policy seeking outcomes, means that the benefits and the burdens are distributed unevenly. Investors and executives capture the upside while workers absorb the volatility.
Consider the contradiction. Lucid is cutting American workers while preparing to launch a vehicle that could significantly expand its market. If the midsize SUV succeeds, the company will need to hire again, possibly the same workers it just laid off, or new workers at potentially lower wages. This cycle of hiring and firing, of treating the workforce as a variable cost to be optimized quarter by quarter, is corrosive to the industrial base that the EV transition depends on.
And let's talk about the $50,000 price point, because it reveals something important about the EV market's structural challenges. $50,000 is positioned as affordable for Lucid, but for most American families, that's a year's household income. The EV market has largely served affluent buyers, and while prices are coming down, we're still far from the point where electric vehicles are genuinely accessible to middle and working-class consumers. The workers being laid off by Lucid almost certainly can't afford to buy one of the company's products.
There's also a question of industrial policy here. The U.S. government has invested billions in EV subsidies and tax credits through the Inflation Reduction Act. That's public money being used to support the development of electric vehicles. When a company like Lucid takes advantage of those incentives while cutting its workforce, it raises legitimate questions about whether public investment is producing public benefit, or whether it's primarily subsidizing returns for private and sovereign wealth investors.
The Saudi ownership dimension adds another layer. The Public Investment Fund isn't a charitable organization, it's a strategic investment vehicle for the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Its involvement in Lucid is part of a broader portfolio that includes massive investments across tech, entertainment, sports, and yes, continued investment in oil and gas. The PIF is hedging its bets, profiting from fossil fuels today while positioning for an electric future. American workers are the ones navigating that transition with the least protection.
And that brings us to our synthesis, because tonight's 4 stories, from the Philippines to Albania to European energy policy to an American EV factory, are all chapters in the same book.
They really are, Alex. Let's connect the dots. In the Philippines, we see corruption eroding public trust and draining resources from life-saving infrastructure. In Albania, we see citizens taking to the streets because they've exhausted every institutional avenue for accountability. In Europe, we see fossil fuel companies hoarding windfall profits while the energy transition is starved for funding. And in the US, we see workers bearing the cost of an industrial transformation that primarily benefits investors and executives.
The common thread is the concentration of power and wealth in the hands of a few, at the expense of the many. Whether it's politicians siphoning flood control funds in Manila, a prime minister clinging to power in Tirana, oil companies lobbying against windfall taxes in Brussels, or a Saudi-backed EV company cutting American jobs to optimize its balance sheet, the pattern is the same. Those with power use it to protect their position, and those without power pay the price.
And here's what's most dangerous about this pattern: it feeds on itself. Corruption discourages investment, which slows economic growth, which increases desperation, which makes people more vulnerable to corrupt systems. When fossil fuel companies block climate policy, the resulting energy crises create the very price spikes that generate their windfall profits. When workers are treated as disposable, consumer spending weakens, which slows the EV market, which leads to more layoffs. These aren't separate problems. They're interconnected failures of governance and accountability.
The Albanian protesters understand something that policy wonks and editorial boards often miss. Accountability isn't an abstract principle, it's a practical necessity. Without it, public money gets stolen, climate policy gets sabotaged, and workers get sacrificed. The people in the streets of Tirana aren't just fighting for Albania. They're fighting for a principle that every democracy depends on, that power must answer to the people.
And the European debate over taxing fossil fuel profits offers a glimpse of what an alternative could look like. If you redirect windfall gains from oil and gas companies into renewable energy infrastructure, you simultaneously address climate change, improve energy security, create jobs, and reduce the political power of the fossil fuel lobby. It's not a silver bullet, but it's the kind of structural reform that shifts the balance back toward the public interest. The question, as always, is whether leaders will act or whether money will talk louder.
What strikes me most about tonight's coverage is how the most important stories in the world are connected in ways that rarely get discussed. A corruption scandal in the Philippines, street protests in Albania, energy policy in Europe, and job cuts at an American EV company. On the surface, these seem like unrelated events. But when you look at the underlying dynamics of power, money, and accountability, they're all part of the same global story. And it's a story that demands better journalism, deeper scrutiny, and more informed citizens.
That's exactly why Truth Report exists. We don't just read you the headlines. We dig into the structures underneath, the financial flows, the power relationships, the patterns that connect seemingly disparate events. Because the people making decisions that affect your life, whether they're politicians in Manila, prime ministers in Tirana, oil executives in London, or sovereign wealth managers in Riyadh, they understand these connections. They operate across borders and industries with sophistication. Citizens deserve the same level of understanding.
So here's our call to action tonight. Pay attention to the corruption index, not just as a ranking, but as a measure of whether your government is working for you. Support the protesters in Albania and everywhere else where people risk their safety to demand accountability. Demand that your representatives support taxing windfall fossil fuel profits to fund the energy transition. And ask hard questions about who benefits and who suffers when companies slash their workforce while preparing to launch new products.
The information is out there. Transparency International publishes its data. Al Jazeera and reporters on the ground in Tirana are documenting what's happening in real time. The numbers on fossil fuel profits and subsidies are public record. Corporate filings tell you exactly how companies like Lucid are spending their money and treating their workers. The tools for accountability exist. What's needed is the will to use them.
That's all for tonight's Truth Report. I'm Alex Truth.
And I'm Maya Clarity. Stay informed, stay skeptical, and never stop asking who benefits. We'll see you next time.